Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. This talk is called Tuckman Was Wrong. I don't know how many of you, by show of hands, are familiar with Tuckman's stages of team development. Okay. So for those of you that are familiar with it, when you read the title, there's probably one of two reactions. The first one being, what? And the second one being, duh. I don't know which reaction you had, but I'm glad that you're here. My name is Doc Norton. I am with a consultancy out of the States called Enbele. We do process and leadership coaching for companies that write software for some reason or another. Talk again, Tuckman was wrong. So I want to start off with kind of what inspired this talk in the first place. And it's this idea in Agile that we need to have stable teams. That what you need to do is take a group of people and you put them together, and you keep them together, and you bring work to the team. This is, at this point, a pretty commonly known thing in the Agile industry as the way that we're supposed to do things. If we look at some of the stuff that's out there, this is from one of the Scrum guides at some point or another. We've got to keep the team stable. Right? And there's a couple of reasons in here that are provided. They get to know their capacity, and it makes business possible for the business to have predictability. But when you get into a conversation with folks, and you actually ask them, all right, okay, but really, like, why do we have to have stable teams? What's the reasoning behind that? There's one answer that I hear more often than any others, and it fundamentally comes down to because Tuckmans. And the answer is that, well, you see, Tuckman stages, forming, storming, norming, performing, teams go through these various stages, and in storming, they have this really low productivity. They've got this loss of productivity, and we don't want teams to go through that. We don't want that to happen. So what we want to do is get a team together, make sure they get through those stages, and then once they're in performing, we keep bringing work to them, and they just do an awesome job, right? So we don't want teams to go through storming any more than necessary. Now, I don't know how many of you know, Tuckman's theory was developed in 1965 by Bruce Tuckman. And fundamentally, the way that this theory came about was Tuckman took a look at a bunch of other sociological studies around team formation, and from that extracted some commonalities and came up with this theory, this concept that teams go through these stages. If you're familiar with it, you've probably seen a chart, something like this, where we see kind of productivity at each of the stages. So a team starts off, and they're forming, and productivity is decent. Everybody's polite at this point. And we're all kind of feeling each other out. Nobody's really speaking their mind. They're kind of waiting to see where everybody else is. And we operate like that for a while. Things seem to be okay. But sooner or later, the fact that that dude keeps showing up late to stand up, or her commit messages are garbage, gets on your nerves, and you say something. And then you go into this storming phase. And then eventually, everybody hugs and makes up, and you start creating these standards for the team. You're now norming, and then eventually you get to this high performing, right? Now, by show of hands, how many of you have experienced this on a team? You've started a brand new team, and you went through these exact stages in this exact order. I got a few. Okay, I got a few. So often when I ask people, have you experienced this? They say, yes, in fact, I have, right? I was on a team that went through this, or I've seen this. I've seen teams that have gone through this. Really? Did you actually experience this? Or have you experienced this? Storming seems to last an awfully long time. Like a really long time. Or maybe you looped back and forth from storming to norming over and over and over again, and maybe eventually you got to performing, right? And it doesn't really look like this. That looks maybe more like this. And usually, often, I find teams where the outcome is actually more like that. Fundamentally, we return to the productivity level we had in the very beginning. So when you ask people, when you give people this model, here's Tuckman's model. Have you experienced this? People look at their experience and they go, yeah, I think I have. And then you show them other possibilities and they go, oh, no, wait a minute. It's that one. It wasn't actually the first one you gave me. It's actually. Now, here's the thing. I told you this was put together in 1965. And it was basically based on a comprehensive study of a bunch of other sociological work that had been done, and then this theory was derived. From 1966 to 2011, there have been dozens upon dozens of studies in attempts to validate Tuckman's theories. None of them have been conclusive in their validation of that theory. All of them have shown some other result, sometimes similar, but never exactly as Tuckman articulated it. Then, let's say, I think 2011, the US government did an extremely comprehensive study across military, inside of different offices, different institutions within the government, mapping all of these behaviors that are identified with these various stages and looking at where does this actually happen in teams. And what they discovered was this is more valid in terms of Tuckman's stages. So there's a few things you need to look at here. One, we can see from this that teams don't go through the stages sequentially. They actually experience several of them simultaneously. The other thing I found in this study was that it was about 2% of any of the teams that went through all 4 stages in order as defined. Right? 98% of the teams did not go through these stages in order as defined. Several of them didn't go through all of the stages. Some of them went through them, but in different orders. And the other thing they found very commonly was that storming, which you'll notice is actually the dark brown along the bottom here, happens consistently. And on high-performing teams, even when you're in performing, storming is still happening. You might also notice that there's a slight peak in storming, which coincides with the peak in norming. So it is during the period that you are establishing the norms that the majority of the storming actually occurs. So the thing for me with this is, if the reason that we need to have stable teams is so they don't go through storming, and the reality is teams are always going through storming, then our premise was wrong. The problem wasn't because Tuckman's. We had a model, but it was wrong. It wasn't the actual problem. Now, here's the thing that bugged me about this for a while. Stable teams did make things better. I mean, if you've been involved in software long enough, and you've been on projects in environments where people are constantly being moved around from project to project, and they're on multiple things, and then you ended up in a stable team, you probably experienced the stable team was a better thing. Why was it better? So if the problem wasn't because Tuckman's, what if the problem was because resources? What if the original problem that we solved was a problem that still exists today in various forms and organizations? Because resources. You know what I'm talking about, right? These are our resources. they happen to have families, souls, and feelings, but also we can burn them out and replace them, right? That's resources. Now, how many of us have actually given up and started dehumanizing people and calling them resources, or work in an environment where that has happened? Yeah. Several folks have picked up the term. But all right, so these are our teammates. These are our friends, our family members. This is our big project portfolio. We have lots of important things that need to be done this year. Now, the executives got together and they talked. And someone suggested, some of these projects can't get done. And the executives said, hogwash. We can make this work. There is a way. All we need to do is find the right people and put them on the projects. We'll just look at their skills, we'll look at their abilities, we'll look at their capacity, and we'll just kind of figure that out. So we start distributing the projects to various people, and after a while, voila, all projects fit. We have sufficient resources, we can do all of the work. Lots of people on multiple projects. Average is about 4 projects per person, right? How many of you have had this happen? Yeah, all right. So let's take a look at this simply. There's some math here that really kind of like helps us out. So let's say that you have 4 tasks that you need to complete, and they are 8 hours each. You are on 4 projects. Each of these is the #1 priority task for that project. You must get started immediately because you cannot tell that project manager that you aren't started on the work. So you want to start them all at once because that makes sense, right? In an ideal world, 4 tasks, 8 hours apiece, when you split them up, will take you 32 hours. In the real world, what happens is for every task you have, every project you need to switch from, there's a cost. That context switch, right? Setting aside all the things you know about project A and getting refreshed on everything you know about project B, what the current status is, where the team is, what your responsibilities are, where you left the work, all of that costs about 20% per project, compounded. Those 32 hours, if you're lucky, it will take you 48.75 hours to complete those 4 8-hour tasks. Notice also, the first task is finished at the end of 40 hours. None of this work gets done for an entire week. Done. You're making progress, but nothing actually gets done. Whereas, if you started one and finished it, and then went on to the next one at a time, it would take you approximately 32 hours. And you would have finished the first one within a single day, etc. It's a fairly easy way to calculate this, but I'll just take a look at it. This is a slightly different view on this whole thing. So 8 hours of work. When you add in the tax, approximately what total duration does that take? We're not looking at all of the time that's lost because you're working on something else. This is just that one task. 5 projects, 13.62 hours per 8-hour task to get that work done. So this adds up pretty quickly, and just kind of this here to reiterate. First one takes 40 hours to actually get across the line to completion when we go this route. So this is one of the problems that we had, right? One of the problems was that we were putting people on multiple projects. When we set up stable teams, all of a sudden, you were on one project. What was the other problem that we had? Very similar from this. everybody's 100% utilized. We made sure that everybody was busy all the time because that's good, right? That gives us a return on our investment, making sure that people aren't lollygagging or goofing off or anything else. Unfortunately, it turns out that in knowledge work, when you don't give people time to actually sit and think or socialize or do pretty much anything else, their productivity actually starts to decline after a certain amount of time. And it looks more like this. As you are 50 and 60% utilized, you've still got a pretty good throughput. But you start to get to 80, 90, 95% utilization, and your productivity actually diminishes. The amount of time that it takes you to get something done starts to expand very quickly. So we'll take a look at this. I want to take a look at an 8-hour task again. Now, it turns out there's a bit of a hook on the far end of this, because if you're only 10% utilized, you're actually slower on something, right? But this is one project and your performance if, with utilization. Now we add in another project, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you're on 3, 4, or 5 projects and you're at 90% utilization, we're right back to an 8-hour task takes you 40 hours to get done. That's just the task. Now if we actually thread those all back in again with all the delays, you're looking at an 8-hour task. We'll get done somewhere in a 160-day time period. So when we put teams together, stable teams together, what we actually solved was these two problems. Teams were on one project, and because we had all the right folks on the team, we actually created slack in the teams. We didn't necessarily need someone full-time, 40 hours a week, nose to the grindstone on the testing stuff, or even on coding. We had pairing and all that, right? So we actually, stable teams solved because resources. It didn't solve because Tuckman's. But that is why stable teams were better. And stable teams, I think, are better, depending on the environment. But in my experience, a new set of problems arose from this. What happened when we created these stable teams was we created these boxes. We created these silos. And now this team is fully self-contained, and it's very infrequent that the members of this team communicate with the members of that team, unless there's some dependency between them. Right? Maybe there's some team that's doing an API and we consume that API. So we talk to them on occasion. But if my responsibility is to optimize the shopping cart experience, I might never talk to the people on the search team. And I certainly don't care about the people on the personalization team. So we're not talking to each other anymore. And what's happening now is we have these silos, we have these fiefdoms. You get these cults of personality. This one group behaves completely differently than the other one. And of course, they know they're much better than the other one too. Then you take this, and the organization grows. And you start creating various services. And you're splitting it up over and over again. And you have all of these small, self-contained, siloed teams. And we're losing knowledge share. We're losing empathy for one another. What we learn about front end on one team doesn't get shared to the other teams. Teams that are better at delivery, innovation, they start to actually covet that information. They want to look better, so they're not sharing the information out anymore. I spent a number of years at Groupon. 4 years, I was a global director of engineering culture for them. And when I got there, this is exactly what I saw. A whole bunch of groups. Each team was amazing in their own right, but they were all basically fighting with each other in some capacity. There's no longer any empathy in the organization. Now here's the thing. Among many other issues, product wants different skills over time. The product wants different skills over time. What I mean by that is not the product manager or the product department, but the product itself wants different skills on the team over time. When we started the company, the fact that we're able to move really quickly and run experiments and do things, that was a skill that we needed. But as we grow and mature and we move towards platform, we need a different set of skills. We don't necessarily need to be able to do that very much anymore. Maybe on the fringes, right? Maybe on the edges where we're trying to figure out some new stuff. But a lot of things we need to do is stabilize the platform. Make sure that it runs well. Make sure that it scales well. It's a different set of skills. Michael Feathers has talked about this quite a bit. There's a lot of words in here. Basically the same thing. He's saying, look, different areas of the code are going to need different skill sets at different times. Here's the part I want to focus on. None of this is static. It's fluid. If you have the ability to reteam, then you are able to do this sort of thing consistently. So it turns out that as we grow, not only do stable teams in a way hurt our culture and our ability to deliver good software, but we actually need to be able to reteam on a regular basis in order for the environment to mature and to follow what it is that the product actually needs. So what does it mean to reteam? What am I talking about here? Am I talking about the old days where managers came in and said, all right, this project is over. This team is now disbanded. We have a new project, and we will reform it with the people that we need. No, it looks very different these days. But there are many, many organizations that are now reteaming internal to the organizations. So I'll give you a couple of examples of organizations that I think are doing this fairly well. First one is Valve. How many of you are familiar with Valve software? All right, so a few years ago, one of their internal handbooks was leaked. I'm not sure how much it was a leak as it was a release, but among other things at Valve, they have these things they call cabals. And basically, it's really just a multidisciplinary project teams. It's the same thing you would think of as a project team in most organizations. And they've actually self-organized into these basically temporary groups. And kind of the way that it works is as a developer there or as a team member there, doesn't matter what my role is, I go to lunch one day, and you and I are chatting, and you're telling me what your team's working on, and I think that sounds kind of cool. And in fact, I'd kind of like to work on that. So I come in the next day, take my desk, and I unplug it from the central power line that's right here. And I roll it over to your area, and I plug it in. And I'm now on your team. That's it. There's not a management approval process. There's not anything else. And the theory, the belief, what they're looking for is the important things will get done. The stuff that has to happen, the things that add value will happen because people will be interested. And they've operated very successfully this way. Spotify, who hasn't seen this thing by now, right? The Spotify model, I've got it in air quotes because this is not the Spotify model. This is a snapshot from a moment in time in a white paper that people have looked at and have said, oh, that's the Spotify model. The Spotify model is the things they did to get to that moment in time and the things they've continued to do to get to where they are today. Regardless, when we look at this model, since folks know it well, you've got squads, small cross-functional teams focused on specific aspects of the application. You've got tribes, which are collections of squads right? And they work in similar areas of the application. But notice a couple of things here. You've got a guild crosses chapters, tribes, etc. Engineers, team members can very readily move around this grid. If you're staying kind of in your specific role within your tribe, it's fairly easy to move from squad to squad. You additionally, through guilds, have connection to other folks that work in roles similar to yours or have interests similar to yours across the broader organization. The fluidity gets a little bit lower for these folks as you start to move from tribe to tribe. That takes a little bit more effort than moving from squad to squad within a tribe, but still the fluidity is there. Groupon, what we ended up doing was we created a very lightweight process that allowed folks to move from team to team fairly easily. We went from a question of if I can move, to a question of when can I move. Managers and directors were no longer allowed to block a move. As the individual that wanted to make a move, you needed to take on the responsibility of co-creating your plan for moving. So Valve, my plan for moving is, that's it. Groupon, we need a little bit more governance around it, but still folks are allowed to move as easy as possible. What we got from this, among many other things, was knowledge sharing. What we started to see was leading practices within groups, things that they had figured out that made their work easier, that made their work better in some way, were now starting to be shared again across the organization in very open, dynamic ways. I don't have a slide for it, but LinkedIn has this concept of tours of duty. If you work at LinkedIn, you get a job, a role for 6 months. At the end of that 6 months, you can sign up for another tour, or you can elect a different tour within the organization. So you've got a commitment for a set time period, and then you can move. So what are some? So you think about reteaming. There are some patterns that have kind of emerged. Heidi Helfand? Sorry, I always get her name wrong, so I'm trying to be very careful with that. Heidi Helfand actually has a book on this, and I'll make some links to that available in a minute. Some simple patterns. If you're looking at, like, all right, how might we do some of this stuff in our own organization? How might we actually do some reteaming? First one, I refer to it as socialization. Here, a set team adds a new member, makes a concerted effort to actually onboard them, get them acclimated to the team, right? So one of the first things you can do is actually teams start to create their own onboarding in a way that they would actually acclimate members. Teams actually get good at absorbing new team members the more that they practice this. Side effect is, because we're trying to figure out how to onboard these folks and teach them how we work, we're actually having those conversations and starting to codify those fairly well. So we can start to actually, ingest individuals into teams. Then the next one that I would look at is mitosis. So now we've got the ability to actually bring people in and quickly bring them up to speed on a team. Mitosis, here, to create a new team, many organizations, what we do is say, hey, we need a new team. All right, we'll bring like a couple of our good people, we'll bring them together from 3 separate teams, and we'll hire the rest. With mitosis, what you do is you pick a team that you feel is performing well or is doing things the way that you want them, that you would like to see them done, and you grow that team. Ideally, they've already gone through some socialization process, so they've got an onboarding that allows people to enter easily and get up to speed on the way that team works. When the team gets to be a certain size, so we're beyond the 2 pizza team size or whatever it is that your kind of heuristic is, you split it. And you've now got 2 teams. But you've got 2 teams that have a shared understanding of how work is done. The way that I would look to split those is as much as possible through self-selection. Here's the 2 projects. the one that we've been working on, maybe the new one that's coming up, and see if we can get a self-selection process going where they create the team on their own. Another reteaming pattern is volunteer fire department. So here, teams members volunteer to create a temporary task team to solve a key issue and then rejoin their team. Now, a lot of places have tiger teams or that type of thing that they'll actually do, but usually the way those are created is, again, someone in management decides, we need people on this, we need our best people, so we're going to take these 3 and we're going to make them do this. With the volunteer fire department, what we're doing is we're actually getting people volunteering in, folks that actually want to do the work as opposed to folks that are obliged to do the work. We often find that a junior developer that actually wants to do the thing performs as well as a senior developer who is being coerced into the work. So why not get someone who's happy to do the work? Another common pattern to just kind of help share things across the organization is trading places pattern. I think this kind of makes sense just in and of itself, but you'll actually see teams will swap 2 members for some period of time. Oftentimes, again, the idea is that we're sharing knowledge between these teams, right? I come join your team, and I observe certain things that you're doing. I might share stuff with your team. I might go, hey, you know what? This is what we do on our team, and it seems to work maybe a little bit better than what you guys are doing. You might want to try that. I might learn something from your team, bring it back to my regular team. Hey, I saw them do this thing. It was really cool. And so it's just a way of kind of a tour of duty, if you want to think of it that way, but it's a way of getting folks onto teams temporarily, sharing knowledge, learning, bringing it back. Ultimately, I look at this, today's day and age, this is Nayan Harjawala said this, reteaming is inevitable, so you might as well get good at it. And I see this very much the same way that I saw continuous delivery, continuous deployment when it first kind of came out, right? People are like, you can't do that. It's super hard. Deploying code is hard. And the idea was, great, you're right, it's hard. Do it more, you'll get better at it. Reteaming is hard if you're not doing it. Do it more, you'll get better at it. Thank you. We've got about 7 minutes, I think, for any questions or anything. Cool. Totally self-explanatory. Okay.
Whenever there's a new team or new team members, he organizes those get to know each other and common values.
Right.
Those kind of workshops to get going.
Right. So the basic question was, when you're starting a new team, how much support do they need? For her, at work, they have coaches that will come in and actually help teams to form their team norms and a bunch of other things to help kind of get things moving. I think when you're first starting teams, it can be extremely helpful to have the coaches. So if it's brand new team, they've never worked together before, having someone facilitate them through that process, it can have very high value. If then you start looking at one, socialization, so that they actually get how they get to where they can actually onboard without having the additional coaching, and you're growing teams through something like mitosis, it reduces the need for coaches at that point, right, at the kind of team formation point, and ideally then you've got coaches that are maybe focusing on higher performing items than on just getting things started. But if it's brand new, yes, I would certainly, whether it's an outside coach or it's someone internal to the organization that can help to facilitate that type of stuff, it does make a big difference. And oftentimes, it says Tuckman was wrong, right? All models are wrong, folks, right? It just happens that some of them are useful. Tuckman's model is useful, certainly. It just, the science shows that it wasn't exactly correct. That doesn't mean that we don't go through storming. It doesn't mean that we don't, wouldn't benefit from that kind of help. Mm-hmm.
Is there any data as to how productivity goes when people are reteaming as often?
So two-part question, how often should you reteam, and is there any data around what happens to productivity with reteaming? I'm going to give you a really bad answer. It's a consultant's answer. It depends, right? So how often should you reteam? Let's start with that one. It really does depend. There are some organizations that reteam intentionally, every year at some cadence. In other cases, it might be more of a pull, where we notice that the market is shifting, that maybe our strategy has shifted, and now is a good time to reteam, right? Studies around productivity during reteaming, I don't know of a whole lot. I think Heidi's got some stuff in her book that is around this particular topic. If you are doing a systemic organizational reteam, right, a complete restructuring, yes, productivity is definitely going to go down. If, again, you've kind of grown the organization through this mitosis process, and basically what we ended up with when we do this, as we kind of grow a team a little bit larger and then split another team out, you are fundamentally coalescing on a set of standards that exist across all of the teams. If you are then sharing people between those teams, so doing kind of a trading places or that type of thing, you are maintaining those standards consistently. Reteaming becomes much lower impact, because when I move from this team to this team, much of the way that we operate is the same or similar, right? So we have a lot less kind of disruption. Does that help? Ish. Any others? So it sounds like what you guys are doing right now is there is some reteaming, but it's around kind of there's a need and a team comes together. And what you're finding is that there are certain groups of people that seem to elect to be together often or work well together. Yes. So how do you spread that around the other teams? So I guess there are two approaches to that, right? Or there's probably several, but two common approaches. One would be, let's say it's a core team of 5 people. And so what we do is we deliberately spread those 5 people to other teams to kind of get that love around the organization, right? Typically, what I see when that happens is what we've done is we dilute their ability to influence. Because now you have one person among, maybe the new team is 8 or whatever. Instead, what I see as effective is you add 2 or 3 people to that team. They get acclimated. You add 2 or 3 more to that team. They get acclimated. Then you split out, right? So it's kind of, if you know that those 5 folks are working well together, how do you keep them together and leverage that to spread it throughout the organization? All right, we are at about 30 seconds. So I will be around if there's other questions. Thank you very much.